I'm going to be glazing over this game and I am going to enjoy it. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition I think is one of the greatest arcade racing games ever made. I enjoy it even more than some of my favourite Need for Speed games. Midnight Club in general has been an amazing and tragic series that Rockstar has left behind, and yet old and new generations have returned to and have discovered or rediscovered this franchise. For me, Midnight Club 3 is the shining example of how to make a fun and amazing arcade racer, taking the same lessons from Midnight Club 2 and for the most part, improving on them tenfold. I'm going to go into more detail why I feel this way soon, but I also want to talk a little bit about my history with this game and why it still means a lot to me. As a kid, I loved the Need for Speed games from Underground 1 to Most Wanted and even Carbon, but Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition was truly something special in my eyes. 2000s Rockstar was an amazing era for gaming. Whenever they had a game coming out, you knew that it was going to be awesome, and as someone that loved Midnight Club 2, my mind was fucking blown at the trailer for the third game. My autistic obsession with cars as a kid only intensified with this trailer alone. The first two games didn't have licensed cars, and 3 flipped the script completely here. It showed real-life vehicles, and this was a huge deal at the time too. The large Cadillacs and Hummers, the lowriders glazed with 24-inch rims, spinners, chrome and gold that made up the pimped-up rides that we could cook in this game, as well as the variety of other vehicles that we got to enjoy. Nice-looking and shiny cars was a pretty big thing at the time, and this game capitalized on that. This game made me want a car more than any other racing game out there at that time. Part of what makes racing games great in general is that they can give you a window of driving a vehicle that's out of your reach. It's part of what makes games like Assetto Corsa a popular title, especially with the Shutoko Revival Project mod that gives you that Japanese expressway fantasy. Midnight Club 3 gave me experiences of driving nice vehicles in its own way. Out of all of the old school racing games that I've been nostalgic about, this is going to be the strongest one in terms of that feeling. For a long time, I generally considered it to be my favourite arcade racer of all time, but I wanted to revisit it as an adult and see if it's still there. Nowadays, I think it is still one of my absolute favourites of all time, but there are some other things too that disappoint me about the game, at least in comparison to 2, which I'll go into later. And now I'm going to talk about this game in more detail, and yes, I do have some other things to say about it, because it is not perfect. From the get-go, Midnight Club 3 is a massive upgrade in graphical fidelity, car variety, car handling, as well as additional mechanics added to it. Midnight Club 2 was the more polished version of 1, and 3 is the culmination of those two games, but with licensed cars to boot. Early 2000s for me was like a golden age period for the arcade racing scene. Some of the most revered racing games of all time came from the 2000s, and while they all have some nostalgia smell still, there are genuine reasons for why they are regarded so well even to this day. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition just happens to be the best overall in my opinion, out of the 2000s games at least. Handling is dynamic across all the vehicles. You have a pretty in-depth customization system that accommodates for different types of cars and bikes, 3 detailed and fun maps to drive, and 4 if you count the remix. An amazing soundtrack and dynamic open world racing. Like the other 2 games, you're someone once again wanting to make their way into the racing world, but this time you end up in a garage with your first mechanic in the game, Oscar, who hooks you up with your first ride in the game, and this time you have to actually buy your cars. This is a fundamental change in the series, because before you would unlock vehicles just by beating rivals. Well, things have changed here now. You have to actually buy the cars that you unlock from this point on, but don't worry, you'll still be able to get free rides from tournaments and by beating all the club races, and it's something that you're going to want to do. The system here is a lot more complex. The classes and the car types make a big difference in your experience in the races. Racing Class B cars with a Class D vehicle is going to be an uphill battle, even with all of the performance parts available for it. You have import tuners, you have muscle cars, SUVs and trucks, bikes, choppers, exotics and luxury sedans. There is something here for everyone, and this game accommodates for your tastes in cars better than some of the other arcade races that came out at the time. With your first ride, you'll be getting into races of different types, city races which are repeatable races that you can grind for extra cash if you want to save up for a new ride, or customize your current one further. Club races are exclusive to specific vehicle types, and beating all of the races in said vehicle type will net you a new ride. To unlock the club races, you have to race the rivals on the map, and I'm gonna be honest here. This is actually one of the most disappointing aspects of this game. You see, Midnight Club 2 did a great job of bringing the rivals to life with cutscenes and memorable appearances and personalities. It shows you who you were racing against, and you weren't just driving a faceless rival. Midnight Club 3 though doesn't really do this at all. Sure, you have their names, and some of the bikers do show off their appearances somewhat, but it just doesn't have the same effect as 2. All I really get is a phone call from the mechanic that gives me a bit of information about them. Having rivals in racing games made the early Need for Speed games, the first 2 Midnight Club games, memorable. They gave you a motivation to win and a desire to beat them, especially with characters like Razor from Most Wanted and Darius from Carbon. Midnight Club 3 doesn't make any effort whatsoever to do this, and it's such a disappointment. The rivals in Midnight Club 3 are just more opponents to beat in order to unlock the club races and the tournaments. Progression is similar to the first 2 games. In 3, you beat the rivals, you get access to a tournament, and you repeat this process until you unlock access to the next city. Your mechanic in San Diego, the first city in this game, will send you over to the next mechanic in Atlanta, and you do the same thing over there until you get sent to Detroit.
No! No, not Detroit! No! No, please! Anything with that! No!
Like 2, this game has 3 cities in the career mode, except this time it's all set in the US. You have San Diego, Atlanta, and Detroit. And with the remix version, they bring back Tokyo, which has its own career mode called Tokyo Challenge. While I liked the more unique settings in Midnight Club 2 a lot more, Midnight Club 3's cities do have a lot more detail and are in general more fun to drive in. All 3 cities feel fairly balanced, even with Atlanta and Detroit, where things heat up more with the races. They didn't frustrate me to the same degree as what I went through in 2 when I was in Paris and Tokyo. The cities in 3 still have their own unique atmosphere and aesthetics. San Diego feels pleasant and can be fun to drive in due to it being the first map and having more of a starter feeling, and the routes aren't too complex either. Atlanta is somewhere in the middle. It feels a bit more run down in comparison, but it's still fun to drive in, and the routes here are a bit trickier. Then there's Detroit. While this is my least favorite of the 3, it was never Paris levels of frustration. The only part that annoyed me in the game was the snow during races. That makes your car slide like the rain. Tokyo, on the other hand, is pretty similar to what it was like in 2 in terms of its map layout. But because of the significant improvements to the handling model, as well as the special abilities you get to unlock, it made for a much more enjoyable driving experience in 3 than in 2. The 3 cities in the career mode are just all really solid. Lots of unique routes that you can use to your advantage, and plenty of opportunities to go wild with the physics through jumping or just going at high speeds. Like the other games, it still has the same open-ended racing that makes the street racing in Midnight Club unique and dynamic in comparison to games like Need for Speed. In Need for Speed, you feel a lot more limited to where you can go in the races. In Midnight Club, this isn't the case at all. Every attempt is unique because you have all the routes open to you and you can go wherever you want during the races. This gives you means to find unorthodox shortcuts that can give you an edge in the race, and the only other racing game that I've seen that goes for this as well is Burnout Paradise. It can be tricky at first, but you get used to it before you even know it, and again, you'll have to get used to restarting a few times because the routes can get tricky and the traffic is still very annoying. Like I said in Midnight Club 2, the traffic and the objects on the map gave me more trouble than the opponents themselves. As long as you don't lose too much speed during turns and be smart with your nitrous, you can manage a lot of the races fairly well. In fact, you'll generally have an easier time in this game than in 2. Midnight Club 3 in comparison to 2 is a much easier game, and there are 2 main reasons why. Number 1, performance parts tied with car variety. In Midnight Club 3, you have access to some efficient cars early on, and even a chopper or the 300C that has pretty good speed, and you can get through San Diego with those vehicles quite easily. Once you have a sports bike in Atlanta, you can pretty much just use that vehicle until you're done. And once you're in Detroit and you have access to the McLaren F1 LM, you'll have an easy US champs on your hands, which is the final stretch of races that you have to do in order to beat the career mode. Because of the existing car variety and the performance parts, you can make the game much easier, whereas in 2 you had to rely more on your driving skills and map knowledge. The fastest vehicles in Midnight Club 3 allow you to manage races okay even if you drive sloppily. In 2, you're generally fucked if you drive like shit. Then there is the special abilities, Aggro, Ram, and Zone. Midnight Club 2 did technically have special abilities, even the overpowered fishtail mechanic that I forgot to talk about in the video regarding that game, but they were more just driving mechanics that made up the overall gameplay. The special abilities in 3 are more like trump cards that can give you a unique advantage in the race. Roar lets you push traffic in front of you away, Ram lets you demolish traffic, and Zone gives you a slow motion, kind of like the speed breaker from Most Wanted and Carbon. These abilities can help you out of sticky situations with the traffic or just tight turns. For me, Zone was the most useful mechanic because later on, the faster vehicles make the races more intense and the ludicrous speeds means less reaction time overall. To get these special abilities, you have to win at least 3 club races for the respective vehicle type, and they don't all share the same special abilities either. Tuners, exotics, and bikes have Zone, muscle cars and choppers have Raw, and SUVs and luxury sedans and trucks have Ram. There are some outliers in between the different vehicle types that would have the abilities that you wouldn't expect, but if you want something like, say, Zone, then you'll have to make do with the types of vehicles linked to it. With those 2 points, I don't ever want to hear that Midnight Club 3 is harder than Midnight Club 2 again. Moving on from the difficulty, we have the amazing gameplay to talk about now. The handling is some of the best I've ever experienced in an arcade racer. There was even a time where I used a cheap steering wheel, drove a Monte Carlo, and got myself into some intense races. The game is fast, all of the vehicles feel unique and satisfying to handle, and their sense of speed is so well realized. Couple this with the pretty in-depth customization that you have visual eye candy and polished driving mechanics bundled together. When I was a kid playing this game, I was more into the Hummer trucks, the muscle cars, and the choppers. But as I grew older, my taste in cars changed, and nowadays, JDMs were my go-to vehicles. Revisiting this game again, I didn't really go for the same cars as I used to as a kid anymore. The bling and the oversized rims didn't really matter that much to me. I just liked having fast and great to handle cars to drive, with more practical customization. You have the same slipstream mechanic from 2, the 2 wheelies, and of course the weight transfer mechanic with the bikes. Burnouts this time around don't destroy your vehicle's health, something that was annoying in 2, come to think of it. Now I can do burnouts to my heart's content or dance with the hydraulics that you can attach to your vehicles. The game just goes nuts with the vehicles here. Again, it's just fast and fluid. They all handle differently, they all feel unique, and can be adjusted in the settings if need be. The jumping feels satisfying, and like 2, you also have the same air control mechanic. 3 just feels so much more polished overall. It made some missteps though, like with how they handled rivals, and with Tokyo Challenge having no rivals at all, and the sometimes inconsistent AI in the races. However, this game does so much right that even looking back, it's hard to find genuine faults of the game beyond what I've already just mentioned. Midnight Club 3 is just peak arcade racing in my opinion, and it handles a lot better than even some of the more recent Need for Speed titles, games that I have mixed feelings on. The soundtrack is varied from rock to hip-hop, electronic, and even has dancehall and reggae music, which adds even more flavor to the soundtrack overall. It has amazing customization that's intuitive and varied. It improves on the handling model of Midnight Club 2 tenfold, and graphically, it still holds up really well for a 6th-gen title. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition's partnering with Dub Magazine, the automotive connection to all 3 cities makes this game feel like a big celebration of car culture, where people get to drive beautiful vehicles and customize them without having to spend a dime. Besides the game, of course. As a kid, it was the closest thing to being able to drive a Hummer truck or a Cadillac and put 24-inch rims with spinners, driving a Chevy Hot Rod, a green Murcielago, or the import tuner cars I fell in love with like the Skyline. And yes, arcade mode and race editor also make a return with some improvements along the way, and with the race editor, you have a full view of the city that you're creating your race in. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition will always be an amazing game in my eyes, and I can only keep glazing it for so long before I keep repeating myself. If you're looking for peak arcade racing, then this is it in my opinion. Just make sure that you play the remix version for the most complete experience. It may have been seemingly abandoned by Rockstar, and the last Midnight Club game we got was Los Angeles, but the game hasn't been abandoned by the old school Rockstar fans or the racing game community. Now if you'll excuse me, I've got some cars to pimp out and some club races to finish. Thanks for watching.